Woodhead, and I'm the Clinical Services Coordinator for the British Psychotherapy Foundation. And it's been a webinar that I've wanted to put on to support our members and think about this period of time, which has been so extraordinary, disruptive, challenging, and sometimes surprisingly enjoyable. I just mentioning actually before everyone arrived that it was something that I wanted to put on in 2019, June, and to coincide with Gillian Isaacs Russell's visit to London. And it's just worth saying that at that time, which I suppose is just a year ago, it didn't really occur to me at all to have a seminar online, but I wanted to put a seminar together talking about online work, which now we've travelled so far from that time. I will first of all introduce Todd Essig, and then I'll introduce Gillian Isaacs Russell. There will be a 5-minute break between the two for drinks, and then we can start. I'm very pleased to invite Todd, who I believe is in New York, and Dr. Todd Essig is a training and supervising psychoanalyst at the William Allinson White Institute, widely known as a pioneer in the innovative use of mental health technologies. He publishes and lectures widely. He has served on the editorial boards for Contemporary Psychoanalysis and JAPA, and recently co-edited, along with Gillian Isaacs Russell, a special issue of Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Psychoanalysis and Technology. In the aftermath of 9/11, he was board chair for the New York Disaster Counseling Coalition, providing free mental health care for first responders and their families. He recently accepted an invite to be co-chair of APsaA's, the American Psychoanalytic Association, COVID-19 advisory team. He also writes Managing Mental Well for Forbes, where he covers the intersection of technology, psychology, and culture. His practice is in New York City, where he treats individuals and couples, almost all of whom used to come to his office. I'd just like to now introduce Gillian. Dr. Gillian Isaacs Russell is a psychoanalyst in private practice. She is a member of the British Psychotherapy Foundation, the British Psychoanalytic Council, the American Psychoanalytic Association, and the International Psychoanalytic Association. Her book, Screen Relations, The Limits of Computer-Mediated Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, was published by Karnac in 2015. She has served on the editorial board of the British Journal of Psychotherapy and is currently on their reviewing panel. She recently co-edited with Todd Essig a special issue of Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Psychoanalysis and Technology. Dr. Russell writes, speaks and teaches internationally on technology and its impact on intimate human relationships, particularly in psychoanalytic treatment. She currently serves on the COVID-19 advisory team for the American Psychoanalytic Association, and she practices in Boulder, Colorado, USA. So on the other side of the country from Todd. Okay. Once again, thank you for agreeing to do this seminar, and I hand over to you, Todd.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend this morning, or in your case, this afternoon with you. I'm going to be doing a PowerPoint presentation. during the course of which, if there are questions of clarification, please feel free to use the chat function like Todd mentioned. I may choose not to answer your question if I think it's something I'm going to be getting to, or if it's something I think is off topic, but I do invite questions, and we'll have after the presentation time for a more general discussion before the break. So now just give me a moment here while I share screen and get things started. Okay, there we go. So that's the title of my presentation. It's the long haul of teletherapy in a pandemic, making it work. I'm sure over where you are, like where we are here, this is not something which is going to be ending anytime soon. And we have to gird our loins for a very long, long slog through some very distressing times. For us and the work we're doing, trying to do our best to take care of our patients, the place I want to start is with the current cultural and clinical context. And the way to introduce that is with this graphic, which comes from Dr. Jeffrey Taxman, who works in disaster psychiatry. And this is a model he uses mostly for discrete event disasters like tsunamis and earthquakes, but it applies to us as well. It just means that the event is more ongoing. We're pretty much here. I think people can remember back at the beginning of March, the honeymoon phase where we were all going to come together and beat this thing. And now we realize that we're really not. It's where we're kind of in the midst of dealing with the consequences. Some feel that we're kind of still here. Some people feel we're closer to bottoming out. The important point to keep in mind is that at some point we will start to recover. We will eventually, whether it's in 6 months, a year, be able to safely reopen our offices, at which point we have to once again reestablish the experience of psychological safety, which right now does not exist in our offices. So that's kind of the time course, and I think it's useful to keep that in mind. Here there's some kind of like telehealth realities of what we're going through. There was no, there was no intentional reflective initiation phase for remote treatment. We were dumped into remote treatment almost overnight. People moved their practices almost in their entirety. And we're still dealing, I think, with the consequences of the absence of that reflective initiation and the near total beginning of it all. We've lost our familiar rituals of collegiality and support. This meeting would have been in person with nice snacks and walks around the block and so forth had we been able to meet in person. I've lost my monthly lunch with colleagues that I've been having for the last 30 years, but the rituals of collegiality and support are gone. Most important, there's no difference in the vulnerability, fear, and risk. We are in this together with our patients. We're both together in a shared reality of very distressing times. There's also part of that is the uncertainty of not knowing how and when the COVID-19 era ends. And this uncertainty can weigh on us both psychically and practically. There's no economic security for ourselves and our patients. I'm not as familiar with what's taking place where all of you are now over in Britain, but I know here the economy is in a precarious, uncertain, difficult position, and people don't know what they're doing with their jobs. We're also on the front lines of the mental health pandemic, and our patients know it. Some patients ignore that. Other patients commiserate with how difficult our worlds might be these days. We're also struggling with the reality, and I just recently wrote about this at Forbes, about the incomplete information about the risks and rewards of mid-pandemic in-person work. Going back to work is not the same right now as reopening one's office, because mid-pandemic in-person work is going to be fundamentally different from what we used to do, as much as we might passionately want it to be otherwise. The problem with that is that the procedures for viral safety, masks, disinfectant, face shields, screen guards, timing, etc., all those procedures for viral safety conflict and undermine the necessary experience of psychological safety. How to promise someone a safe space when you're letting them know that you find them a potential source of infection and they should regard you as a potential source of infection. So those are some telehealth realities. One of the things that has happened over the last few months is that both Gillian and I have been running these groups with other colleagues and talking with people who have been also running these groups, and come across some common experiences that happen as we're now all working via telehealth. And here are some common personal experiences from being what's called in the constant presence of each other's absence. It's exhausting. I don't know how other people feel about this, but my experience, my colleagues, the people I've talked to, my students, at the end of the day, it's much more exhausting. And to kind of make this a real thing, I gave it a 3-letter acronym: Pandemic Therapy Exhaustion, PTE. So now that it has a 3-letter acronym, it's a real scientific fact. I hope people know that was a joke. People are also reporting being lonely and distracted in session. It's much more difficult to focus on a screen than it is to experience a person. You feel closer and more distant to patients. Sometimes their face is right there, or their voice is right here in your ear, and you feel closer and at the same time so much more distant because it's a 2-dimensional technologically mediated experience. There are memory changes we're all going through because the experience of the other has decreased salience with increased attention. We're not remembering things in the right way, in the same way. Oops. Empathic accuracy diminishes. We can still access the inner world of the other. We can still get to know who they are and allow them to know we know who they are, but it's more difficult. It doesn't work quite the same way, and it requires increased humility. I find myself, and others do too, frequently saying things more like, if I'm hearing you right. So there's a need for increased humility because empathic accuracy has diminished. Attunements, emotional attunements get less granular. Instead of having a millisecond by millisecond joint choreography, it's by 1/10 of a second or a second by second because of the synchrony and timing of what's taking place on screen. So attunements are less granular. Our bodily sensations are very different. Whether it's the fact that we're not sitting in the same place with another person or we're not engaging in the interactional synchrony, the bodily sensations we're experiencing in the presence of the other are different. Then there are also some common relational experiences that have been noted, that being in the constant presence of each other's absence. We have newfound access to each other's private spaces. I've never met any of you on this screen, and yet I can see all of your home offices or living rooms. Patients see the same for you and you for them. Some patients are becoming more revealing. The online disinhibition takes place and they're more free with their conflictual, shameful, difficult material, while others experience the absence of a containing presence, the absence of social facilitation that's constricting, and they're less revealing. Both of you together share the same distress. There's loss, uncertainty, fear, grief. Those are external realities that are now shared, like a bad smell in the office would have been shared. New interpersonal patterns emerge. At the beginning of almost every session with almost every patient, there is a kind of an implicit health check-in. You know, hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? And I respond with some version of, I'm as good as can be expected. I'm well given the circumstances. At the end of sessions, we've developed routines of kind of waving to each other right before clicking the leave button. I think of it as more of a focus on the poetry at the expense of the choreography. That what we're doing is we're paying much closer attention to the words and trying to drain from each utterance as much meaning as possible because we're missing the choreography of being bodies together. Gestures become performative rather than automatic. And even now, as I'm talking to you, I'm very conscious of making sure if I'm making a gesture, my hands are in the screen, and they're bigger gestures than they would be otherwise. So gestures become performative. So these are all things that are common experiences, both personally and relationally, that are being reported, experienced from being in the constant presence of each other's absence and form the fabric of the current clinical moment. And then there's the biggie. We're relating both through and with technology. We all have not just a relationship with each other, but there's my relationship with my technology, my relationship with their technology, their relationship with their technology, their relationship with my technology, and that changes what's taking place in ways we have to attend to. So with all of that happening, with all of those differences, all of those changes, with this clinical context of distress, I mean, how is it possible to make telehealth work at all? How is it possible that we actually are able to make it work? You know, both Gillian and I have for many, many years been trying to sound an alarm bell that we can't think of computer-mediated psychotherapy as the same thing as what takes place when you're in person. We've been kind of thought of as the real critics, but now we're both saying, wait, but yeah, it does work. You have to make it work. So how is it possible to make it work? And the answer is telepresence. Telepresence is the experience that allows for psychotherapeutic processes to take place. What is telepresence? You know, telepresence is being able to feel you're in the presence of someone else when you're sitting all alone. It's being able to feel you're in some kind of joint space when you're sitting by yourself. Okay, how does it work? Well, people experience presence of any kind, not just telepresence, but people experience presence if they're able to act in an external world. Whoops, sorry. My technology just intruded. If they're able to act in an external world where they can successfully transform their intentions into actions. And that's from somebody named, let me look at my, Gillian Isaacs Russell in a book called Screen Relations. And that's true whether you're sitting here. So if you're sitting by yourself, I want you to all kind of slap your desk or slap the edge of your chair. I can see you on video, so if you're not doing it, you're gonna get a demerit. Okay, you do that, and you immediately feel the sensation in your hand, you hear the sound, your body moves, you immediately get feedback that the intention had been successfully manifest. That gives you a sense of being where you are, sitting where you are, being present. So here's how that works. There's an intention, which leads to an action, either physical or social. You say hello, someone says hello back, and if the timing is correct, you're able to feel present one to the other. If there's that temporally appropriate feedback, there's the experience of presence, both actual and telepresence. That never happened at a distance prior to the 1840s with the establishment of Morse code and the telegraph. That was the first time there could be this social telepresence where the operators were able to feel the presence of the other. So let's start to get a bit more psychological. Telepresence is a generic concept, and the technology is allowing you to experience this if there is temporally appropriate feedback that an intention achieved its goal. But there are psychological variables present as well, and this is where it starts to get more clinical finally. You have to pay attention. Telepresence doesn't work if you're not paying attention to that narrow little bit of information coming at you that's signaling the presence of the other person. So attention is necessary. If you turn away from the screen, if you don't pay attention, if the mail delivery comes and rings the doorbell and you have to get up and go, all of those things distract your attention and makes it so that telepresence disappears. But there's more than just attention, there's also desire. You have to want to have the experience. You have to want to be present with the other one. It's very easy just to kind of suddenly look away if you don't want to be with someone. To leave a relationship when you're physically present with the other person You have to overcome a tremendous amount of social friction to actually have a patient, for example, get up and storm out of a session. When you're working online, if a patient feels, I don't want to be here with you any longer, they can manifest that intention simply by looking away. And then they are no longer telepresent with you. They are present where they are by themselves in their room. The third psychological factor that's important is imagination. You have to give yourself over and allow yourself to become entrapped in this illusion of non-mediation. You have to be able to kind of imagine that you actually are sitting with another person in this way. The reason this is clinically important is because people who are in regressed states, or people who are in states of mind where they are experiencing things in an overly concretized fashion, may not have the full repertoire of imaginative capacities necessary to fully experience the presence of the other. So that's important to keep that in mind. So that's telepresence. Let me stop here just to see if there are any questions of clarification before going on to the next main topic, which is what makes a telepresence-based psychotherapy session different from meeting in person. Telepresence kind of makes it similar. Telepresence is how we can kind of experience the same kinds of things. So, okay, no questions of clarification. I'm going to move on to what makes telepresence-based psychotherapy session different. And the answer to that is a concept that's called affordances. Affordances, it's a relatively difficult concept because it has to do with potentials. It's moving from the declarative mood to the subjunctive mood. The affordances of the environment and what it offers, what it provides or furnishes, either for good or ill. This comes from J.J. Gibson, and the concept of affordances comes from the study of perception. Of how we kind of take in the world. And the idea being that we don't take the world in as an abstract representation. We take the world in terms of the potentials for action it affords. I know this can be a bit complicated and abstract, so I want to do a quick thought experiment to kind of drive home what the concept of affordances is all about. Let's say we're meeting, not online, but let's say we're meeting in person. There's one group meeting in person, attending this lecture. And then there's also a group attending via Zoom. I ask half of the in-person group to turn to the person next to them, say hello and shake hands. The other half of the room, I say to smile and turn to your neighbor, say hello, but there's no touching. No touching allowed. And everybody does that. For the group with Zoom attendance, I say to smile and say hello, and again, there's no touching. The transcript of those two meetings are exactly the same. Smile and say hello, no touching. But the meaning is fundamentally different because the in-person group affords the possibility of touching, whereas the Zoom attendance does not afford the possibility of touching. Therefore, the in-person affords the experience of restraint. It affords the experience of following rules. It affords the experience of restraint. The Zoom attendance, no touching, does not afford that experience. It's the same transcript, the meaning and experience is different. At the same time, Zoom also affords experiences that the in-person doesn't afford. For example, those of you who are on mute, you can say really nasty, critical things as loudly as you might want. And there's going to be no relational consequence for that. Not that anybody wants to do that. But the Zoom attendance would afford the expression of critical, hostile, aggressive thoughts that the in-person experience would not afford. So it's important to kind of have that in mind, that we're talking about potentials, that what differentiates a telepresence session from an in-person session is not necessarily what takes place. No touching, the same in both groups. It's not necessarily a difference in what takes place. It's a difference in the meaning of what takes place, because the range of potential experience and the range of potential action are radically different in the two groups. I hope that's been worth the time. And one way now to talk about that is to drive this home clinically, is to talk about three different dimensions of affordance difference between in-person sessions and telepresence sessions, between what happens online in general, whether it's a Zoom cocktail hour or whether it's a Zoom session, and what takes place in person. The first difference is risk, consequence, and trust. There's a difference in risk potential. The two contexts afford different experiences of danger and therefore of safety, because the relational experience of safety in the presence of risk is fundamentally different than the absence of risk. If there is no possibility of being dropped, then there's no possibility of ever feeling fully held. One patient in Gillian's ethnography of remote treatment who moved online commented on how anemic things felt when there wasn't the possibility of kissing or kicking. Not that she or her therapist kissed or kicked each other, but they both experienced the possibility of doing so because being in person afforded that, whereas online did not afford that possibility. As a result of this, for example, defenses can become much harder to see as patients react to diminished risk with some online disinhibition. So if you notice the online emergence of previously defended against themes and topics, it's probably not because of some elevated accuracy in your interpretations, as much as it is a reaction to the attenuated risk the online context affords. The second general dimension of clinically relevant difference is richness or repleteness. Instead of the tsunami of direct experience when being in the presence of someone else, all we now have is a relatively narrow channel of information that we have to attend to in order to preserve the experience of telepresence. The result is an experiential paleness of being with the other. It's paler, it's like a washed out watercolor. But we have to make this work. And we just have to be ready and be aware that the experience is less rich. You have to watch out for the way some distance treatment providers report uncharacteristic forgetting or uncharacteristic note-taking during online sessions to compensate for the relative paleness. Some others have noted treatments just likely take longer. Another frequent observation is that online treatments have more frame violations. And this is not surprising, since these sessions and the frame itself, because of the diminished richness to the experience, are less salient and therefore less memorable. The way I think about this is like it's the difference between in-person is like driving on an incredibly bright sunny day where there's so much coming at you. To be able to do it well, you almost have to filter things out with sunglasses. While working online is like driving through a dense, difficult fog. You have to really hone in and pay attention to what's going on in a very, very different way to find the information you need. You're still able to get to where you're going, but it's going to be much more tiring and much more difficult. And it requires a kind of attention not present in bright sunshine. The third general dimension of difference is relational embodiment. There are very different possibilities and processes when physically co-present than when meeting via screen or speaker. Walking to and entering a room is quite different from clicking on a window or swiping open an app. The physical proximity of greeting and leaving requires different processes, different bodily processes than just flipping a switch. Some of the attunements and misattunements, as well as body-based pre-verbal attachments possible with shared embodiment, are absent with screen relations. Familiar and important processes of implicit imitation and empathy are altered by the absence of shared embodiment. More on this in a few minutes, but the consequence is that all the familiar ways your body registered the presence of the other and experienced the body of the other has been turned upside down. We've lost one of the ways we're used to listening to other people and finding them. Again, we can make it work, We can, and we actually have to. It's just going to be different, and it's going to be much more difficult. So let me turn now specifically with those differences. We have a clinical context that's organized by the pandemic. We have telepresence as the way that these distance sessions can work. We have the concept of affordance to understand how they're different. And now we're going to kind of hone it down into how we can kind of make the changed clinical processes that come from this actually work. What are those clinical process changes? I'm going to talk about 7 of them that kind of I think are very significant and important, both in terms of things that used to take place that don't, as well as things that now take place that used to not take place. My wish for the outcome of this morning or this afternoon would be that all of you would take these concepts of telepresence and affordance and really think through for yourself the clinical process changes you're noticing in the work that you're doing. A big difference is that the facilitating environment and the experience of feeling held is different. It used to be that patients came to our office, sat in our chair, used our tissues, drank water that we provided, and that the holding environment, the external holding environment, was something that we kind of gave to them and then they recreated psychologically. Now, they're doing that all themselves. It's their computer. They have to find the room. We can and should, we'll discuss later, involve ourselves in that process. But the process, the clinical process of creating a facilitating environment, has been radically altered. One consequence is to, I think, we have to focus more on the way that we internally and psychologically hold our patients, because we're less able to kind of give them the experience of being physically held. A patient who grabs tissues as a bit of a transitional object leaving the office now can't have that, and those who need it may need to be handled differently. For example, I have one patient who's prone to very traumatized patient who's prone to some very severe regressions, who used to very often take tissues and hold them in her hands and talk about how valuable that was to her, reminding her that her murderous fantasies weren't true and that there was this external world. She can't do that now. So what we've done is I actually sent her emails during the week between sessions to remind her that I'm holding her in mind and that we'll be meeting again sometime soon. And she finds that very useful. There's a new experience that happens in session of being alone in the absence of the other. The same patient who grabs the tissues will frequently kind of shut down. And when we're in person, we were alone in the presence of each other. Now when this happens, she disconnects from the telepresence, turns away from the screen, loses the imaginative capacity, doesn't want to be in contact with me. And now there is this experience in the session of being alone in the absence of the other. And that requires moments of refinding, reconnecting, but it's something which wasn't afforded in the in-person session, but now the telepresence session does afford the possibility of being alone in the absence of the other. Another clinical process change is that the therapeutic alliance can become a therapeutic collusion, protecting telepresence by avoiding regressive experiences. Above all else, we want to stay connected. We don't want to lose telepresence. We don't want to lose the experience of being with the other. As a result, there can be a collusion to avoid those topics and those experiences which might put telepresence at risk, either through decreases in attention, decreases in desire, decreases in imagination. There's a change in intercorporeality, how my body is reacting to their body, reacting to my body, reacting to their body. This is a non-representational experience of two people being together. And these are processes of implicit imitation, which can often form the background, the physical background for an exercise of empathic imagination. You find yourself choreographing your movements similarly to their movements, or you notice that they cross their leg the same way that you are crossing your leg. Your breath becomes in train with each other. There are all these micro moments of implicit imitation. As a result, empathy is different, and interactional synchrony is another way that bodies are relating one to the other, where the movements are the same and the activation levels and attunements take place. All of these are lost or radically altered, if not lost, when you're meeting online. Attention changes. That kind of full openness to everything going on around you, that kind of letting it all in, is replaced by a focused attention, which you need to have for telepresence to take place, and also a continuous partial attention that these devices compel. No matter how, how disciplined someone is in turning off notifications, quitting out of other programs, etc. If you're looking on your screen, you've got some CPU cycles in the back of your mind wondering what's happening on your email, on your text, on WhatsApp, on Twitter, what's coming in, what's not. So focused and continuous partial attention replaces free-floating attention and reverie. Another aspect of a new clinical process change is the way technology intrudes when it works and when it doesn't. Both. I think there's no surprise that I'm saying it intrudes when it doesn't work. Everyone is familiar with dropped signals, pixelization, audio changes, loss of synchrony between the picture and the sound. All of these ways that technology just intrudes and says, hey, we're not really together. There are these machines in the way and they're not working very well. But technology also intrudes when it's working exactly the way it's supposed to. In the process of encoding information, transmitting it, decoding it on the other screen, the technology introduces what are called mediation artifacts. There's an analyst named Cheryl Branham, who's also a computer scientist, who's written a pair of beautiful articles about the presence of mediation artifacts. For example, in the process of encoding, transmission, and decoding, the signal has gotten so strong that if the other person is silent, the line would sound dead. You would wonder if there was, in fact, a dropped call. So what the technology companies do is introduce white noise in the process of transmission. Nothing you can do about that, it's there. So when you're sitting there with kind of as wide open a mind as you can have, trying to take in the subjectivity of the other, you may think you're hearing the noises coming from the patient, but you're not. You're hearing noises that are coming from the technology. So these mediation artifacts are intruding in your experience of the subjectivity of the other in ways we don't even notice. Finally, in terms of a clinical process change, the need to maintain telepresence itself becomes an enactment requiring discussion. How someone moves or doesn't move their screen. Someone who's using a phone rather than using a computer or vice versa. Someone who takes their phone and walks around with it. The way that someone can kind of develop a relationship with their device that we think is the relationship with us. So those are the clinical process changes that I've noticed. Let's turn now to strategies to make it work. And I apologize, you're about to experience my pun of the day. So we're going to talk about not just one paradox, but two paradoxes and a frame. So that's the pun of the day, and we'll leave that just where it is and not talk about it ever again. So paradox one, the first strategy. everybody's pandemic experience is the same. There's grief over what's been lost, whether it's meeting in person work, social life, family gatherings, a feeling of safety, future planning. We're all grieving that, and if we're not, we're avoiding grieving that. But there's grief over what's been lost. There's uncertainty about getting through the present day. Where to go, where not to go. Should, cousin Laura be allowed to visit because her daughter had her college friends come over or not? What are the rules for this? Our national leaders in both our countries are doing an awful job in providing clear guidance. There's tremendous uncertainty about what's too cautious, what's not cautious enough, what to do, what not to do. And then there's fears for the future. Everybody is afraid of what's going to happen next. Is there a second wave? When is the second wave? How bad will it be? Will the vaccine be safe? Will the treatments be worse than the disease? Who knows? There's fears for the future. So everybody's pandemic experience is the same. And everybody's pandemic experience is completely different and individually unique. And one of our challenges is being able to hold this paradox and being able to kind of move in and out of when it's a shared experience and when it's a unique experience. We have to attend to the unique personal vulnerabilities and triggers that people have in response to these distressing times, while at the same time never losing sight of why the person is in treatment. That what we're doing is not just a holding pattern to get people through the pandemic, but it's actually to begin to provide them with the mutative and transformative experience that brought them to psychoanalytic care at the very beginning. So this is a paradox. We have to keep in mind everything is completely the same and completely different. The second paradox, the second strategy, is specific to telehealth regardless of whether it's in a pandemic or not. We have to really cultivate becoming fully entrapped and immersed in the tech-mediated relational moment. We have to fully and completely buy into the illusion of non-mediation. We have to be like those people in, I forgot the name, but it's an early, it's a film of early cinema of the train coming into the station and everybody fleeing because they think the train is going to be crashing through the screen. We have to be those people in the seats, feeling that experience with our patients. We have to completely buy into this illusion of non-mediation. And at the same time, and here's the paradox, we have to maintain a reflective distance from becoming entrapped by focusing on the differences. We have to be able to say not just that, no, that's not really that train isn't really coming in, but we have to understand how film works, how light works. We have to understand why people are fleeing from that, what that feeling is like, as well as understand those who are sitting in their seats who have not become entrapped and who don't buy into telepresence and the illusion of non-mediation. And what I find clinically useful, and one of the reasons I spent time talking about those three concepts, is to stay focused on risk, richness, and relational embodiment as categories of experience that patients are experiencing, which allows me to maintain this reflective distance from this illusion of non-mediation. So the challenge is once again to have this paradox of keeping two things in mind that are fundamentally incompatible. And the third is the frame. And this is simple, no paradox. The third strategy is you have to build and attend to a remote session frame. We can't just assume it's the same as what takes place in person. Now, I want to play a short video of an approach to building the frame. That's not something I'm advocating, but I think it might be worth watching for reasons you'll see once it's over.
Hello, Jerome.
Oh, hi, are you there? You're there.
I'm here, but you are partly there.
Oh.
You, once again, don't understand where the camera is in your laptop or whatever it is you have at work.
Well, I can see it. What, is this better? Hold on.
There, yes.
Can you see me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good.
Yes.
I'm glad that you were able to meet me at this time.
This is the time that we both agreed on. That's fine. Remember, Jerome, now you only have 3 minutes. It's not the 50-minute sessions. You know, the whole point is that you can actually achieve something during your sessions, which I think was a real struggle for you.
Well, it was, but I have to say that I was getting the impression in the last couple of sessions that I was boring you. And
I'm not bored. I mean, I have enough of an inner intellectual life to keep interested in anything that even you could be saying. All right, listen, this is good. It brings me to something I've been wanting to discuss with you. I was really very hopeful when I switched you from the 50-minute in-person sessions to these truncated 3-minute sessions, hoping it would prompt you to get to your issues.
Right.
Okay, that is certainly one approach to building an online frame. I'm not advocating it, but I figured it was, I mean, if you're going to spend a Saturday afternoon here, you might as well have a little humor. What I do want to do is talk about an approach to building a remote session frame that Gillian and I have written about that currently is online at the APsaA website, which can be found here. Some kind of guidelines. And one of the things to keep in mind with this is that a remote session frame, because of the lack of salience, is not something you talk about at the initial session and then assume it's known. It's something which it requires a constant building and rebuilding and reminding. Because without that, it gets lost. And without a frame, it's really hard to be able to kind of interpret and understand what's taking place. Because then you just have everything moving all over. Your ducks just wander all over the place. So these are the 7 points that we talk about in terms of how to build a remote session frame. Some of this is an attempt to take some control back over building the facilitating environment. Some of it recognizes the unique features of what takes place when you're working online. And the first is privacy. It's important to talk with patients about the need for them to ensure their privacy. I work with some people who now go out to their car and have the session in the car because that's the only place they can get any privacy from their family and their children. But privacy is something which needs to be talked about and discussed. Sometimes roommates need to be encouraged to put headphones on or white noise machines bought. I've terminated sessions when someone does not have privacy and it's obviously, they're willing to let it slide, but when the child keeps coming in and interrupting because something is going on, I've said to people, okay, privacy is the first rule of what we're talking about here. Instead of continuing with this, let's kind of find a time to meet when you can have the privacy you need to be able to have a session. We urge people to create session-like comfort. Lying in their bed under the covers in their bedclothes is too comfortable. That's not session-like comfort. Standing in a stairwell might not be comfortable enough. But to work with our patients, especially for those who are sometimes in more difficult economic circumstances, with more difficult living arrangements, to find both privacy and session-like comfort where they're sitting in a chair, they're sitting upright, they have access to their computer. That's part of building the remote session frame. And it's not actually an obstacle to treatment, it's actually part of the treatment. Also to have an office-like setup. Have a box of tissues next to where they're sitting. They can have a glass of water if they want. Even though the kitchen is right there, no, they shouldn't be eating their lunch or dinner. Cocktails are probably not a good idea. Definitely not a good idea, at least not during the session. I work with 2 patients who have a special box of tissues they take out just for the session as a way to kind of help remind what it is that we're doing together. So to have an office-like setup. You also want to dress like an in-person visit. Right now, we're all seeing each other from here up. But whether from there down, you're wearing sweatpants and a bathing suit, or whether you've got a pair of office slacks or office skirt on. So it's important to dress like an in-person visit, and I encourage patients to do the same. You have to take control over your technology and their technology. Turn off notifications, turn off other programs. If you're working audio only, and some people like to work audio only, darken the screen. Don't be picking up your phone in the middle. We also advocate very strongly something that people frequently don't do, and then it becomes something which can be discussed as a resistance, as an acting out. We encourage a 15-minute walk or stretch both before and after the session. Before the session, it's necessary to clear one's mind, to kind of get into a therapeutic frame of mind. You don't want to, click directly from your sales meeting into your session. To take some time in between. And afterwards, there's actually some research that locomotion aids memory. You need to give yourself, you need to have your patients give themselves some time to be able to kind of consolidate the experience and let the memory begin to kind of sink in. This is a way of also taking it seriously. That if you're making an effort to walk before and to walk after, it signals that this is an important experience and not something which should just be kind of glossed over quickly. And finally, to invite location discussions. When you're in a shared environment, you know where they are, they know where you are. And when you're working online, very often they don't. So I find it useful and important to let patients know they can ask about where you are and what you're sitting in and what your physical environment is like. So that's the way we think about the guidelines for a remote session frame. That the strategies to make this complexity of telepresence and these affordance differences with all of these clinical process changes work is to keep in mind a pair of paradoxes and to build a remote session frame. So I want to close by noting that we kind of travel with our patients on unique paths towards introspection and self-knowledge, made possible by whatever capacities for intimacy and empathy we, with them, can manage. That will be true in person or when we're forced online by a global pandemic. Regardless of context, in person, online, we aspire to transformative healing and personal freedom through a relationship grounded in a search for personal truth. Unfortunately and tragically, a part of everyone's personal truth now is that we're living during a global pandemic. The fragility of bodies in response to a viral invasion and corresponding dangers of shared embodiment means we have to stay home, stay 6 feet away, don't touch your face, wash your hands, wear a mask, maybe a shield, don't get too close, don't hug your friends. So clinically, shared embodiment has also become an impossibility. It's a loss we all share. And while being bodies together affords unique and uniquely valuable experiences, both clinically and in our lives, we have a responsibility to find ways to make these treatments work in the absence of shared embodiment, to make treatment work on screen and speaker. Without the risky, rich experiences and consequences only possible when people are fully present and physically co-present one to another, we have to work harder, and we have to learn quickly how to work harder. I hope what we've talked about now, I hope this has been of help. So thanks for giving me your time. And I want to finally close with what I think is most important of all, and I haven't even mentioned it, but I want to close with it. You have to practice self-care. This is really important. The work we're doing now is much more difficult physically and emotionally, and dare I say spiritually draining than we're able to be with people in person. And to emphasize that, I created this animation. Practice self-care. So, thank you very much. And now we'll open up to questions before we shift over to Gillian and our more clinical example conversation.
Thank you very much, Todd. That was wonderful. We've had a few questions in the chat section, so I thought we can do a kind of, raise your hand and ask as well, but I thought I'd go through some of those questions first.
Okay.
And pose them to you so that you can answer. So the first one that we had a couple of times was there was a couple of links and things on the PowerPoint. Will that be shared with everyone afterwards?
Sure, absolutely. I'll send that to you and you can distribute.
Perfect. Yeah, that's no problem. Then we had a question that said, why do you think there have been more frame violations?
Because the frame is less salient. It's less represented. It's less important. It's paler. It's lacking in the richness, and it's lacking in the risky consequences. So because of that, it's just not quite, it doesn't have the same power. And that's one of the reasons why that I said that about, in terms of building the frame, that it requires constant attention. It's something which is talked about over and over and over again, not necessarily as an obstacle to treatment, but as a constituent part of the treatment.
Thank you very much. The next question was to do with, you spoke a little bit about it, but what are your thoughts on the differences between video and audio remote sessions and audio only remote sessions? And what's your experience of it, and your thoughts to do with that?
That's a big topic, something I was hoping to avoid, but I guess I won't. Yeah. Video provides significantly more information. A significant amount of that additional information is incredibly useful. In addition to that, video also provides an incredible amount of bad information. It can be confusing. It can be distracting. It also creates possibilities for people to feel increasingly performative and therefore less authentic. In contrast, audio, it's just the sound of the voice. It really kind of narrows in on the words and the meaning and the sound of the voice. There's much less information, but there's also much less bad information. And the possibility of feeling performatively shamed is much less. So there are lots of variables that kind of are all intersecting, and it's something which people should be comfortable enough to discuss to come up with a way of working together that is useful. I think right now in my practice, I see, I'm ballparking 40% audio only, 60% video. And the people who have chosen to do audio only, one part of that is, I'm just thinking of some examples. One man I see works in finance and spends his day in one after another Zoom calls. So for him, video is work. And the last thing he wants to do is to talk about his dreams, to talk about his feelings for his wife in the same technology that he's using for kind of selling stocks. So we work audio. I see two women, both of whom are kind of in the artist's world, both of whom are extraordinarily attractive women for whom the male gaze, including mine, has been a problem that has been talked about and something that they suffer from. They're finding audio only to be incredibly liberating, that they're able to kind of more freely access their own private thoughts and their own fantasies without this constant, more sociologically based, reflective need to constantly monitor the degree to which I find them attractive or not find them attractive. So there are lots and lots of variables that kind of go into this decision. The important kind of general concept, I think, is video has more information, bad information as well, and this possibility for performative shaming, whereas audio is more focused and limited, but doesn't include so much of the possible negatives.
Thank you. The next question was, could you say something about the challenges of starting to work intensively with a patient remotely without having had the chance to work in person?
Yeah, that's really hard. That's something I struggle with. I've only had 2 experiences of it. the people in my peer consultation group have had a few experiences. So what I'm about to say kind of comes from my personal experience of those two cases, and some people in his peer consultation group I'm in talking about their experience. And what I think is most significant is again, the affordance differences result in a much less intense initial connection. What I frequently do with a new patient is we'll meet for an initial consultation and then agree to meet for 4 weeks for an extended consultation so we can kind of have a good experience before we make a decision about how to proceed. The first person I did that with, kind of standard practice, at the end of the 4 weeks, he was suffering enough that he dove into treatment, but I did not feel I had access to who he was in a way that I felt comfortable with kind of proceeding. So with the second person, what I did was I suggested we meet 3 times in the first week and 3 times in the second week, to just start off with that additional intensity as a way to begin to kind of jumpstart a process which would have been more intense had we met in person. But now we have to use frequency to overcome the paleness of what it is we experience on screen. So I think it's really hard because if you don't have that kind of that reservoir of shared embodied experience, coming to know each other is more difficult. So I used frequency as a way to begin to overcome that, as a way to make it work. It's not the same, but it might help make it work and get people the help they need.
Todd,
yes, did you want to?
can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Louise.
Hi, I just wondered whether or not we could have a couple of the questions and comments from the actual members attending the webinar, as well as if they've put their name, because I was just thinking about the distance that might be being created as well, and it would be lovely to hear a variety of voices in the questions.
I would love that.
Sure. Yeah, I sort of anticipated that people might have put it in the chat because they didn't want to raise their hand and say things. We can certainly, I've seen there's a couple of raised hands digitally. So if you would like to speak, please do raise your hand. I can see that Barbara has her hand raised. So Barbara, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question, feel free.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Barbara. Hi.
Thanks very much. Yes, I mean, it's a sort of follow-on really from the audio or video question in a way, because I have been working principally on the phone with my patients, although obviously the last point about doing assessments, I think that is much more tricky. The only one I've done, the person wanted to speak on the phone, and I think that did create its difficulties. However, setting aside the issue of privacy, which I do think is a very important one and very difficult for many of my patients actually, and one does need to be very aware of that. I have found working on the phone more satisfactory really than with the 1 or 2 less intensive patients I have worked with on video, I think because the phone replicates the couch much more. So obviously you don't have the visual awareness of the patient's movements. You can hear quite a lot actually. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, that's just what I was thinking about it. So I'm much less familiar with video working, and it's much less part of my practice. I was also thinking about the issue of the internal frame that we bring to this situation as well, which other people might want to comment on.
Something a lot of people do with patients who they were seeing on the couch is they will turn the video on at the beginning of the session and at the end of the session, but turn it off similar to someone settling in on the couch. Other people place the technology in a way that kind of replicates.
I'm not using technology at all in that sense. I'm using a traditional landline.
Yes.
But it's still telly.
So the
working. But,
the idea that the telephone replicates the couch better than the video does, it kind of depends on how you're using the technology.
I guess.
Also, the phone, even at its best, as you said, you don't see the movements. It's the poetry, it's not the choreography, which I think very much changes how we listen. But more to the point, it's the affordance difference that I think the gap between the telephone and the couch remains huge.
I agree.
Because of, as Gillian's interviewee said, there's no possibility to kiss or kick. That patients are, I think, when my patients are, when I'm seeing someone on the couch, fantasies about my body, their relationship to my body, sitting with their head close to my lap, all of that is very much part of what takes place, and the unconscious resonance of the affordances that are present form very much the background of a lot of what takes place interactionally.
And you don't find that those fantasies are still present in the remote situation?
Those fantasies are present in a much paler version. Because it's, my body has become a fantasy instead of a physically present object that affords possible interactions.
I can see Gillian's got her hand raised. So.
Gillian?
Right. I just want to add that, you know, some of what the difficulty that we're trying to deal with is employing our memories of the physicality, of the embodied aspect of the people that we meet with. And so it becomes a sort of creative challenge. And Barbara, when you were talking about using the phone, I have some clinicians who are also my patients who are on Zoom all day long and find it extremely exhausting and have opted to use the phone for their sessions, for their own therapy sessions. But at some point, for one of them, we understood from the material on the phone that she was beginning to lose a sense of who I was, of my face, of the consulting room, which I still work from. And so we have this kind of agreement that about once a week, we decide to do a Zoom hello, and she reorientates herself. And I must say that I reorientate myself too, to my experience of her, at least a memory of her and the sense of her embodiment. And then she turns off the Zoom and she calls me on my landline. So I think there's something about employing a kind of flexible creativity when you work with all your patients as to what they may need and also what you may need in order to keep something alive. And it's a real challenge. Anyway.
Yeah, again, can I just respond to that? I mean, there was one of my less intensive patients who requested phone because of privacy issues, actually, but then was able to speak to me, was able to see me for a video session, which actually we both found the tech quite clunky for that, I think. But what emerged from that was a bit like you're saying. She then felt sufficiently reassured of my presence to go on using the phone afterwards. I think it's very variable, whereas other patients do seem to be able to hold that physical impression much more, though all are aware of the loss and the loss of the physical space, often on quite a sort of textural basis, if you know what I mean. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I can see Anne's got her raised. If you'd like to unmute yourself, Anne, as well.
Yes, I just wanted to add something about the phone. Because I guess I'm like so many clinicians, because we moved to remote working overnight, as we all know we did. And I had been doing some phone work with one or two patients over a certain amount of time, partly for pragmatic reasons in the case of one patient. The phone simply became the way I was working. And I am considering perhaps doing, it's interesting what Gillian was saying about the weekly Zoom, because there's one or two patients with whom I am considering of broaching the possibility of Zoom because of what's in the material. But if I think back to why I personally felt more comfortable with the phone than working with Zoom or video at the beginning of the session and then not during, I think it's something to do with my own spatial sense of the horizon. Because in my consulting room, if I'm engaged in free-floating attention, my eyes are actually looking at the whole room. And they're looking around the room, and I might glance at the patient. All my patients are on the couch. I might glance at a patient, or I might glance at my desk, or I might, my spatial relationship to the space actually made the phone at some level feel more like working analytically, even though I completely recognize what's being said about the different types of information that are offered. So I think that's one aspect. And the other thing I just wanted to share, and it goes back to something that Todd was saying earlier about inviting location discussions. One of my patients was terribly concerned once we started working on the phone because she didn't know where I was, in the sense that she didn't know whether I was in my consulting room, and she doesn't know whether the place that she sees me in is a home or a consulting suite. It's not obvious, it's not visible. And I, in a sense, approached this in a traditional analytic way, in that I took quite a long time to tell her that I was actually in the consulting room, because I was doing a sort of classically analytic, first explore the fantasies, and then give some reality information. So, I mean, it didn't last very long, maybe one session or two sessions. And then I did say, yes, I am in the consulting room. And she was incredibly relieved. And it's interesting what you were saying, Todd, because it might be that actually the reality that we're working with is so different from the in-person world of the work, that certain kinds of norms may be really unhelpful in the work. Because I think during those few days where she thought, actually, I might be in America, because she had some reasons for thinking I might be in America, she was terribly distressed. And I kept her, I have to admit, I let her feel the distress for a couple of sessions. And then, you know, it was appropriate to let her know. But I was reflecting on what you were saying about the value of location discussion.
I think that's a really good example of what we all need to do in terms of making it work, because it's not just that there's a difference between the technologically mediated versus the in-person. There's also the difference between a world of relative physical safety and being in the midst of a global pandemic. And because of that, I think many of those norms should be questioned. They shouldn't be avoided, they should be questioned. Does this still apply? Is this something that's going to be useful for this person? I really liked what you said about gaze behavior and the telephone, because with the screen in front, it's so much harder to kind of move your eyes to the side like we frequently would do, and look off and have a private reverie. Very often it feels like being alone in the absence of the other. So I think that was very, very useful, that the gaze behavior is so different on screen.
Well, if I may be permitted just to add one further comment, it also made a real difference when I started wearing headphones, because then I could just sit with my hands in my lap, as I might if I were just sitting next to the patient. I have to confess, I have also been writing some notes, which, I've had a lot of guilt about, but I know I'm not the only one. But the headphones really made a big, big difference. I hadn't anticipated what a huge difference they would make.
Headphones are crucial, and if you're writing notes, that's changing the norms, and writing notes is fine, so long as you're not like doing your nails.
I'll remember that.
Thanks very much, Anne. I wondered, Todd, if you, the next sort of similar to this current sort of train of conversation is talking about the ending of sessions, and how, you know, that transition when you're on a video call or if you are just on telephone, how that's changed and what your thoughts are about that.
No, I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about that, but as you asked that, I realized that I've kind of developed a much more kind of ritualized interpersonal pattern at the end of the session, where if it's video, I'll say, you know, unfortunately, we're now out of time. I'll see you next time. And I raise my hand and I wave and I press the leave button. With telephone, it's the similar kind of, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'll speak to you next time. And we kind of hang up. We're missing a little bit of the gentle ritual of, we're out of time, you gather yourself, they get you stand up, you smile or not, or frown or scowl, depending on what happened in the session. They gather themselves together and leave. But, you know, yeah, it's something to pay attention to. And I think I've been remiss in maybe not paying attention as much as I think now I would like to the kind of abruptness of ending a session. I will also frequently ask, you know, remind people, you know, be sure to take your 15-minute walk, your 15-minute stretch now. But that's done privately, not with ourselves. Gillian, do you have a different take on that, or?
I just want to add, when we've spoken before to people on this subject, some people have brought up that whether the patient ends the session, does the final click, because they're the ones who walk out, or whether you do the final click. And there's been a lot of discussion about it. I mean, I don't have an answer, but I think that it's something to think about, and to think about in session with your patient as to what it means, who clicks first, or whether you both click at the same time. And the other thing that impacts, particularly if you're using something like Zoom, a platform on video, is, as I can see right now, your digital time is always there in front of you. And so it's cueing you in a way, and your patient in a way that it might not do if you're in either a phone session or if you had been in an in-person embodied session. So they're just different things to actually discuss in session, and it will be different from clinician to clinician and patient to patient.
And the idea is to always notice the differences and to figure out how to make it work. I mean, this is a real opportunity for clinical creativity.
That's actually a perfect lead on to the next question I was going to ask, which someone had asked both of you if you've been conducting any kind of pandemic-related research in light of all these sort of, you know, all of this adapting that you're having to do.
Between practice and our work on the COVID-19 advisory team and setting up consultation groups, and a lot of the writing that I've been doing, trying to help between the webinars we're doing, there's hardly enough time to kind of have a glass of bourbon at the end of the night, let alone start a research project. So the answer to that for me anyway is, I'm just trying to survive. Research will have to be at another time. I'm just trying to get my patients the help they need and seeing whatever service I can be to the community and keep myself together, because, you know, the need for self-care, it's not something we've really talked much about. And I made a joke about having a cocktail, you know, but it's really important to kind of do some exercise and to maybe practice some yoga, or go for a bike ride, or go for a walk, or take your dog out, or spend time with your family, or talk to a friend. You know, self-care is something we can't take for granted. So the answer to the question is no. I've been going for a swim instead of conducting research.
Perfectly reasonable, I'm sure. Sounds very deserved. The next question was then concerning, I don't know if you had any experience of this, but how do you deal with crisis or immediate counseling or psychotherapy to a client virtually? So, for example, if someone's having a panic attack or, you know, is really quite seriously distressed, what are your thoughts on the changes that have had to be implemented for that kind of scenario?
I have a couple of people in my practice who are prone to self-destructive fits of emotional dysregulation. And what I've done is increased my awareness of and reliance on some of the DBT, the dialectical behavior therapy techniques, and both of them have my cell number and know that they can contact me if things get difficult and dicey. One of whom has, and we've kind of talked through a couple of crises. So what I think, we have to make ourselves as available as we're comfortable being. And so, you know, I was comfortable to provide these people with, you know, my cell number, and they've used it when necessary. I'd be curious what other people are doing, because I certainly don't have, you know, I'm trying to figure this out as I go along as well as everybody else. You know, luckily I haven't had any severe suicidal crises.
I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand and say anything about their own experience of that. If so, please. I don't know if people are aware of how to do a kind of digital raising of the hand, but if not, I'll just scroll across the screens and see if anyone's got a hand raised before moving on to the next one. Okay, I can't see anyone. But thank you, Todd. We do have someone wanted to ask a question. Helen Davies, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hello, yes, I would like to. Hello, Todd. Hello, Jim.
Hi, Helen. We've had cyber contact.
Nice to see you.
Yeah.
I feel like a bit of an interloper here, being a relational transactional analyst, but I'm going to hang in. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is, have you noticed differences, affordable differences, across the generations in how you've been working? I'm thinking about, you know, the ones who we would talk more about, the digital natives. Like I have a few younger clients who, and I'm struggling with the casualness sometimes of their relationship with the computer, with Zoom. But I just wondered if you'd had any thoughts about that.
I too struggle with the casualness and make a point of emphasizing frame issues. I've also noticed that my younger patients are the ones who are most acutely sensitive and most dissatisfied with what takes place on screen. That I think the more experience someone has conducting relationships online, the more one is aware of what they can't do, and the more they miss what took place in the office.
Yeah.
The patients I see who are older than me, they tend to struggle more with technology. The patients who are kind of younger than me to the digital natives, they're the ones who seem to kind of embrace the possibilities most avidly. And it's my 20-something and 30-something patients who are the ones who are saying, I hate this. I hate this. I want to get back to the office. You're a waste of time. I'm tired of your image. I'm tired of those books behind your head. I'm tired of Zoom. I'm tired of the telephone. So my sense is that the digital natives are the ones who are most sensitive to the differences in affordance and are most sensitive to the constraints of keeping telepresence alive.
Yeah. And I guess I was thinking about that and thinking about that as a kind of parental position, you know, that we come across. Part of choosing to move my clients online, you know, was, well, this is how it's going to be, kind of thing. And I could feel the kind of some of the resistance in being told as well. But thank you for your...
About that, I think there is a good place to really kind of feel the shared distress, because I don't think anybody chose to do this. I think we're doing this because it's the only way to practice right now without putting people at risk of serious illness.
Yeah. Yeah. So the empathizing with their place and that kind of shared difference. Yeah, absolutely.
And I've also let them know, so this one college student I see, that, you know, I appreciate they're doing this because I'm the one who's more at risk than they are.
Yeah. Yeah, that is actually, because I'm part shielding, I'm asthmatic, so I've had to, you know, my part in the relationship known, actually, because some clients, some people in the UK now are going back to work face to face or in person with screens and whatever else. And some of my clients are asking, and I'm having to say no. And, you know, I talk about it, but actually, no, it's not going to happen.
I think we need to start to wrap up now, because I think I'm done with my half of this. But one thing I'll do is when I give Pod the links, I'll include a link to something I recently wrote about going back to the office, and that might be useful.
Yeah, we'll be sure to circulate that.
But I want to say this has been very interesting. I want to thank you all. All the questions were really very much on target and have kind of enriched my experience of it. And you know, one of the rules of disaster mental health, the reason I included my 9/11 experience in my introduction is because it's been an ongoing interest of mine. But one of the rules of disaster mental health is when you're feeling helpless, the best thing you can do is help someone. So I thank you for the opportunity to at least try to be of help to all of you this morning. So I'll see you on the other side of our break.
Thank you so much for having me. I, of course, feel some sadness and loss that I'm not there with you all in person. But as with so many things we're doing now, this has to be good enough. I wanted to say before we started that I'm seeing so many familiar and really lovely faces here. Seeing Anne Scott reminds me that I just wanted to let you all know that there are 2 COVID-19 papers available for early view and also free access with the BJP at the moment. And if you go onto the Wiley BJP website, you'll be able to see them. So all very pertinent to what we're talking about today. This part of the seminar is going to be really heavily clinically focused. To start us off, Jerry Dogmechi, where are you, Jerry? Are you here? We should unmute her so I can see.
Yes,
her.
I'm here. I'm here. Hi.
She's going to present a very sort of brief clinical vignette. She did send me a lot more information, which will come up as we talk about this. Very rich and interesting vignette of a patient. And I know that Deborah Abrams and Eileen Toybin have both also in the chat talked about things that they've encountered with their patients and technology. And I would love it if after we talk a bit with Jerry, that they would chime in. And I invite all of you to do the same. When we've done this before, it's been with a much smaller group, so everyone's been able to pretty much unmute and just speak up and ask questions. And I know that it's not going to be as easy, but you know, if you can really, you know, wave your hand so Pod can see you, I would really like to encourage as free-flowing a conversation as possible. So for instance, after Jerry reads this very brief vignette about her patient, if it brings up things for you, please do join in, because I think that it will be a much richer experience for all of us. And can you tell us a bit about your countertransference? Because I know originally when you wrote a much fuller piece, you were saying that you really had struggled with it.
Oh, yes. I did a very negative countertransference towards her, and felt very uncomfortable about that. And I think it was because I felt she was making it so hard for me to get to know her.
Now that she is actually seeing you at home, I think, you know, one of the expressions that Todd has used to me is she's been able to leapfrog over her defenses.
Yes. Yeah.
Because there is no risk. There is no potentiality when the two of you are separated by distance and a screen.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite important to think about what you see being revealed now that you're seeing her in her home. It reminds me of what George Lakoff, who was talking about the internet, wrote, which is that when you get information on the internet, it will be different information, not more information. And so I think it's quite important to think about what this communication is, because in a very rich way, you're going to be able eventually to talk with her about what she's letting you see. One thing that we know for sure is you can't be the abuser or the person who puts her into care right now.
I think Todd wanted to say something.
I think I just want to share a worry that's been developing in my mind as I heard the story emerge of this woman being able to kind of use the relative risklessness of technologically mediated relating to show you more of who she is. And that worry is the other side, that with her, I would start to be very concerned about a tsunami of shame that will reemerge when you meet back in the office. So I might want to start inoculating against that by talking about the risklessness of the context, rather than it being a resolution of her shame and interpersonal fears.
So it's worth, as we all are working, and these things come up, it's worth wondering out loud how it feels for it to have come up remotely, and also how your patient might anticipate it would feel back in the room. It always has felt to me, when we had a choice about working remotely or not now, but that the work couldn't be completed until the person could come back into the room, where there was, as Todd would call it, the risk, and I would talk about it as the potentiality of that kicking and kissing. Right now, you know, it is not possible. And so it feels to me, it's always felt to me, that the completion of the psychological process of the work needs to be done coming back to the room. Because this is an emergency situation, and because we don't know how long this is going to go on, I think it's really worth flagging it up as we go along. You know, this is how it is now. I wonder, imagining what it's going to be like in the future. Does anyone?
We have another couple of raised hands as well, Gillian. If we can come to Ronan Stillman, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi. What I wanted to ask about is going back to Todd's point earlier about the paleness of the frame. And I'm wondering, what I'm really sitting with is, I do think that there is something very significant in patients letting us into their homes and creating or inviting us to something a lot more intimate than what we could potentially sometimes get in the consultant room, where we get a peek into their lives only through their narrative, through their projection. But when you're in teletherapy, you actually see their physical presence. And I think that reveals and can also trigger a very strong process, particularly around shame. I've experienced a lot of shame being very central to the work that I've been doing recently with patients around either their house, whether it's its appearance or its opulence and privilege, or noise that's coming from other rooms, and potential saying something about the way the house and the interaction between members of the household. So I'm still sitting with this uncertainty around whether I agree that the frame is more pale.
That's a very good observation. I think you do have more information, and you can bring that into the treatment. But I think you have to be very careful about how really relevant it is, not to be seduced by what you're seeing completely. You know, part of what becomes really important in a treatment is the home that you and the patient co-construct in your consulting room, and what they're bringing in the transference and the countertransference. And so some of that truth that we see in their home is not necessarily as unconsciously and sort of centrally, I think, important as the relationship that you co-construct. So in some ways, it's not relevant. And I think you're dancing a very careful dance there, because you're talking about shame, you know, or consciousness of what's behind that person. And of course you want to inquire in that. You want, you know, if you're picking it up, it needs to be taken up, but not seduced necessarily into thinking that you're seeing the real patient because they're in their home, or more truth because they're in their home. Just in terms of Jerry's patient, you know, I think that the sort of shrouded, angry, difficult person who was presenting in her consulting room is really important in the transference and countertransference. It's also important to know that she has access to other pieces of her, which is coming in the colorful house. And I think it would have come in the consulting room eventually too, perhaps just at a different pace. But there is something a bit seductive about what we see. And I think we just have to kind of hold off and wonder about what it is. Is that?
I absolutely agree with you that what we see is not the truth. Yeah, I of course I agree as well with it. There is this seduction of the pseudo-intimate relationship. I guess what I'm saying is, I think that we have because of what's happening, we are put again by default, by the nature of this experience, that we are put in a more forced, intimate situation where I am in the client's house, not just, and they are in my consulting room. There is a bilateral, bidirectional shift almost in power.
Yes.
That I do think
yes
exposes something, which is why I think shame processes, just my experience the last few months, shame has been just center of the work.
Todd wanted to. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more with both of you. And something that I find useful to keep in mind is that the word more has to get extruded from our vocabulary. What we're experiencing is not more intimate, it's differently intimate. And I think the way Gillian framed the creation of a home inside the consulting room, an unconscious home, an internalized home, a home created from transference and countertransference, is not more or less, it's different than being able to see that someone has a tacky reproduction of Picasso versus a Picasso original behind their computer. The experience of difference, rather than more or less, I think allows for a platform to more safely explore those questions of shame and difference. So I hope to kind of edit more out of everyone's vocabulary.
And I think, Todd, I agree again. I actually really agree with this statement about not using more. And I think it's in response to the idea that the frame is paler when we work in telepathy, in teletherapy. That's the bit that I'm still not sure.
Well, let me use your example, because you know, the mind is a contrast engine, and because there's so much non-frame information available now, because there's so much information about the patient's life outside of therapy, just in terms of how the mind works, the frame itself is going to be less salient in comparison. Whereas when you're meeting in the office, the frame and what you're doing with the treatment stands out in much sharper contrast.
I guess I actually think that the frame now is a much more defined frame, because it is in front of me, physical and limited to something, you know, quite rectangular in front of me that gives me a window into something we have never had access to before.
But Ronan, I mean, I see what you mean. I think that's a very sort of way of looking at the frame and the frame and talking about the frame. But I think the difference is that our actual embodied experience is, mine is here in my consulting room. Your patients, or yours is there where you are. We are no longer providing the safe, facilitating environment. We are not the providers, and we're not, as analysts and therapists, holding the frame. So it's stretched, it's changed, it's different. And in all of these cases, our patients are now having to provide for their own safety. And I think that you were saying there's a difference in power. In some ways, you know, that's part of it. We have patients who have been, as Jerry's patient was, you know, impinged on in all sorts of ways. And now we're asking them, they have to provide for their own safe environment. We no longer are doing it. And I think that makes a huge difference. Many of them are unable to do that, or what they provide is very sort of shifting. And in somebody, I can't remember who it was, but somebody was talking about a patient walking. I think it was Deborah, was talking about a patient walking along and having their session out somewhere. You know, this is relevant to the patient's internal experience. So I think there is, as Todd said, there's a difference. There's a difference.
Sue Kegaris, or?
Kegaris.
Yes.
Sue Kegaris, that's me. Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm probably in a minority here, but I work a lot with young people and children as well. So I've had a different sort of adaptation to make. And some of these issues have come through very strongly, particularly in terms of power, where I've often experienced some of my one particularly young patient, having enormous power, because he's in charge of what he shows me on the screen, and he can show me anything he wants on the screen. And with young people, you know, it's not just that we're in their living rooms, we're in their digital lives. So they can show us things, he sometimes plays video games, shows me things that he's made electronically, and lets me in on a lot of extra, as you say, different areas of his life. But he also has immense power over the setting, because he can switch off his video, he can show me rude pictures if he wants to, he can be actually very bullying online in a way that he would never be able to be if he were in my room. So the dynamics between us have shifted enormously and have been really very tricky at times. I'm still not quite sure if we can sustain it. But I think when you're working with you know, young adolescents or adolescents who are very tech savvy, that there's a very different sense of where the power lies and what they're letting you into. And I think, you know, with time, if we went on like this, many more of our patients would also be showing us emails they've got, showing us pictures that they've taken, and all of this stuff, which when we're in our rooms, we have some sense of what's allowable and what we can think about, and what goes beyond what we consider, you know, sort of therapeutic material. But online, all that's gone out the window, and it can be very difficult then to re-establish those working practices that enable you to have enough space to think. So very much a work in progress with that young man, but I think it's an issue that comes up a lot with young people, and presumably will come up a lot more as we get a bit more used to this kind of thing.
Yes, I think that's true. You know, Todd mentioned the online disinhibition effect, and that goes for everybody. That's when one works online, there seems, because there is a risklessness, and because there is not the potential to immediately impact someone, it kind of unleashes a bullying effect. And that, I think probably people have seen that on listservs and on, you know, in terms of posting things online as well. I mean, I think that's true. I don't know if it was in the introduction, but Todd and I have been working with the emergency COVID-19 team for the American Psychoanalytic. And one of the projects that we've had is to set up groups, peer groups all over the US that meet weekly with a group organizer. And they are clinicians who are bringing in the things that we're talking about today. And for the people who are working with children and adolescents, it has been a real challenge, partly because for the younger children, actually concentrating and keeping a connection on the screen is extremely variable. There isn't a shared play with the therapists play things. And for the adolescents, as you say, you know, there's a kind of power that needs to be addressed. And I think for everyone who uses devices to communicate, those devices hold other significances. People look at porn on their devices. They, you know, they do shopping, they look at their bank account or whatever. And all of this unconsciously comes in as we're using the device. And all you can do is maintain your creativity and be very nimble, you know, trying to work with it, because we are all working outside of our comfort zones in all sorts of ways. And this has forced us into areas that we may never have gone into. So yes, it's tremendously challenging.
Thank you very much.
One part of this, I think, really underrepresented discussion of the power differential, which I think is really very thought-provoking, is that there's the flip side of that, which is the incredibly deep feeling of powerlessness we're all feeling, that we're all experiencing. That so far our discussion here has pretty much been on a dimension of making it work into things that might actually be a little bit better. And I don't want to be a complete downer, but let's not forget that this is all conditioned on something which we as psychoanalytic psychotherapists need to always keep in mind: the unavoidable, irredeemable reality of incredible loss that is underlying everything we're talking about.
Thank you. Oh, do you want to go, Gillian?
I just, Todd and I were speaking yesterday about the peer groups that we lead for the American Psychoanalytic, and both of us were noticing that the themes tend to all coincide with what's happening politically, with what's happening with COVID, particularly in the US at the moment, a bit different than the UK. And we both noticed that in our groups, there is a real sense of longing and loss, and trying to think about, is there any way that we can make a connection? People were talking about particularly working with adolescents, and could they meet in a park 6 feet away? What would it be like to be wearing a mask and talking to someone? Again, trying to somehow negotiate the great grief that we have and fear. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gillian and Todd. We have another hand up from Anne Jennings. if Anne Jennings would like to unmute herself.
Hi, yes. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry, I was just waiting for a yes. Yeah, I think my comment probably belongs a little while back, but I think the first thing I want to say is that I think it's really early to be also trying to sort of look at this and examine it. I'm not saying we shouldn't be, or speak for myself. I think it's going to be quite a way down the line before we really kind of know more about the full impact of working remotely in this way. That was the first thing to say, and having to be kind of bearing with waiting to kind of find out. I suppose the other thing is that I think perhaps some of the discussion feels to me a bit weighted on the anxiety-provoking side of working remotely. I mean, perhaps because I'm not in the metropolis and I'm in the regions where we do have to rely really heavily, actually, on remote working, supervisions by Zoom and Skype, and I know for me, I've really welcomed the fact that being able to work remotely also increases accessibility for a lot of people to therapies. So that's one thing. The other thing is I do agree with the comment about paleness. I'm not sure. I think more for me difference rather than being able to discern whether one is paler than the other in terms of the information or the frame. You see, I also work in the NHS where the frame is shot to pieces much of the time, the external frame, and it really does impinge on the internal frame. So I'm really used to finding that incredibly difficult, i.e. finding a good private confidential space within the public setting. And so for some patients, it works really well because the setting is actually more confidential when you're working on the phone in your own private space that you've created as a therapist, that you've accessed, where you can guarantee there's less noise and less intrusion, etc. And then, of course, in terms of what's safe for patients in terms of working from home or clients, you know, for some people, it's very unsafe if they can't get to sessions at all because they can't travel or they can't access a therapist. So I'm not sort of saying we should make a necessity into a virtue, but I just think these things are very complicated.
I agree. And what you've just mentioned are all of the pluses about the availability of technology for people who can't access in-person help. It's invaluable. It's better than nothing. I think when we talk about the paleness, we're talking quite particularly about the research done perceptually and neuroscientifically about the difference between the way that we interact and relate, embodied, sharing an environment, and over technology. And there is an enormous difference in that. The nonverbal communication, all of the sort of the constellation of the way that we're wired to interact does not happen to a full extent when we're using technology. And so by actually, when I wrote about this and I did the research, what I've done is I've offered a lot of cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary research in using technology. And it's, if you know what that is, if you know the research, if you know what you're missing, then you can work with it when you do use technology to use it to the greatest possible good and to make the most of it. But you do have to know specifically what you're missing out on.
I mean, just one follow-up quick comment really is that I take what you're saying and, you know, hear that you've really looked at this too. And I think for me, one of the sort of strands running through my whole experience of this really is that it is so much about loss and transition and trauma. And in a way, we're also having to sort of bear with that there's a lot we can't fix around that. And it's you know, we can look at it, and that may also be kind of protective for ourselves, that we're kind of looking at it and identifying losses, but there's also the reality of these losses. And I'm just struck by that as well, that quite a lot of the dialogue is often about trying to compensate or ameliorate against these losses, when actually we're just in them, aren't we? We're sort of in the trauma, so to speak.
So all you can do with your patients, and also within the work you're doing inside, as you're trying to keep a thinking space, an analytic space, is to point to and discuss what's different, what is the loss. If that can be verbalized and narrated in a way, then it's keeping something front and center that should not always recede. We shouldn't actually be turning a blind eye to the fact that we're working with loss in all sorts of ways.
And then just sort of very quickly to say that we don't also know yet fully what those losses are. So we can identify the ones we do know about, but we also have to bear with what we don't know.
So much so. Although normally we work with staying in the not knowing, being in the dark. This is the darkest I've ever been. You know, I'm quite an extraordinary circumstance. I know Todd wants to put something in, but I just want to flag up that Eileen also wants to add something after this. So, Todd?
Just a quick comment about the darkness we're all sitting in, which is that technology is designed to be a trickster. It's designed to make us think we're not losing anything. It's designed to create the experience that we're having the same experience as if we're in person, when the functional consequences are actually radically different. So I always keep in mind the idea of that technology is a trickster, and that no matter how wonderful the illusion of non-mediation may be, no matter how great the flight simulator is that makes you feel like you're on an airplane, it's not taking you anywhere. So we actually have to work against our training of trusting our experience, to recognize that when our experience is being mediated by on-screen experience, the meaning of what's taking place might be very much different, and we're losing that. We're losing that familiarity with how we used to experience things.
We've got another couple of hands raised. The next one, we will go to Ron Buschjäger, or Buschjäger, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
It's always impressive when people can pronounce the surname properly. So thank you. Yes, Buschjäger is there. I just had a quick question about the way devices have these other functions. You know, that our patients will be looking through things that they use for online shopping or Netflix or pornography or that sort of thing. And it's come up, that sort of thing's come up with a few of my patients, and it's been so fruitful and so useful, because it does give insight into a different way of maybe how they perceive me, but also they're telling me a bit more about their life. But it doesn't come up with other patients. And I just wonder if you could provide some ways of thinking about that, the sort of this new, I suppose, new frame, and this, the way it ends up being colored by these other functions of how we use our screens, and also maybe clinically, technically, how to work with maybe little suggestions that patients might be using the screens in different ways that we could know about.
Originally, I understood this in part simply from material that was coming up. So I had treated someone some years ago who did use the screen for pornography, and it did come into the sessions. And so, then it becomes a topic that you can actually talk about. The other piece of that is when in the guidelines that Todd and I gave, which he mentioned before, one of the things that we suggest is that people shut down all of the intrusive things that could be happening whilst you're actually having your session, and a lot of people don't. And so, you know, you may or may not know, but there will be people checking their texts, checking their messages, and, you know, they will have, I'm looking at my phone here, which is face down, but they will have their phones, you know, available. And I think that on the one hand, you know, if you can issue a sort of general guideline that we know that these things are going to intrude, and if you could make sure that they don't, that would be good. But then when you see or you are picking up that they are intruding, to make that a part of the actual material that you're dealing with. I just see Anne, who's right above you on my screen, wondering whether she wanted to add something to this.
I actually wanted to go back to something earlier. So if anybody else wanted to add something directly related to this, fine. But otherwise, I will make a point related to something about paleness.
Okay, if you hold that for a sec. Louise, did you want to speak to this? Don't know whether she's unmuted.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. Oh, well, thank you for letting me in. I just wanted to pick up a couple of things, one of which fascinated me about Eileen's patient, and the way in which Eileen described the dripping in of reality and the gradual flooding of a reality and eroding the defences that a patient like Eileen described coming through. And I wondered, I have a similar patient, and I was thinking about their reaction to the lockdown, which was one of pleasure, because they lacked, or it protected them from their sense of envy of others. Everyone was in the same boat. Now it's very much more difficult as the lockdown is loosening. The re-emergence of envy and isolation has reared its head again. But the other short thing I wanted to mention, and maybe hopefully I'm not alone, but I've started to feel a bit alone, is the therapist's enactments, ranging from having a cup of coffee while I'm on the telephone, maybe not putting my shoes on, having a few other things in my consulting room that I don't normally have. And I felt a certain worrying slippage about the frame and my own environment.
If I can just link that into what Ron was saying, and that is that, you know, yes, we do have slippage. We all have slippage. Originally, when I did this research, you know, that was one of the things that came up again and again. So this part of the slippage is letting other things into the frame, in terms of what Ron was talking about, that you use your communicating device for other things, and that unconsciously or consciously that comes in, that we ourselves may have slippage in checking texts and things like that, that there is that going on. And I think that just as we have a sort of checks and balances when we work in our consulting room, we have a lot of working with difficult restrictions in order to do the work we do. I think that we have to keep confirming that in the work that we're doing now. So, you know, in terms of clothes, you know, to be dressing for the occasion, as it were. In terms of if you don't normally have coffee, you know, think about whether you're going to have coffee or not. On the flip side of that, we are all undergoing such stress, and we're all undergoing, I think, for me anyway, hour after hour of Zoom or telephone and living in the pandemic. It may be that we have to allow ourselves a cup of coffee. You know, it may be that, you know, it may be that we have to do some things to make our work more possible in this time, and it's having to do with some sort of self-care. So again, there's a sort of flexibility in the way we're thinking about this. So yes, to be aware of the slippages, but on the other hand, to know that maybe if you do need a coffee because it just feels so alone or so long, or the concentration is so intense, you may need to have it.
And I was thinking to myself, well, surely that sort of experience is something that quite a lot of the patients use, because we're all so dedicated to our screens and devices. And I suppose it's interesting to me that comes up with some patients but doesn't come up with others, and how to even draw that out, I suppose, was more of what was in my mind.
I don't know that you can, unless you're feeling that it comes up in the material, and or that you may make a sort of offhand comment about, well, yes, of course, we use this device for so many things, and see what happens. I don't know what you think, Todd, about that.
I'm thinking about a case that was, I think it was included in our chapter together, Gillian, where this is pre-pandemic, and a patient who was a road warrior and kind of was basically raising his children from the road, where every night he would FaceTime a bedtime story and maybe see them 2 or 3 days out of a month. And we're having a session, and he proceeds to kind of get annoyed with his screen because it's where he does everything. And he says, it's where I read to my kids, watch porn, go to movies, do my work, it's everything in the same damn screen. And then he stops and he asks me, what about you and your screen? What do you use your screen for? What do you use your computer for? And that led to a very, very touching acknowledgement that one of the things we're not using our screens for is actually being together. And it led to an awareness of shared loss. And this finance guy, road warrior, who needs to send a postcard to his feelings if he wants to connect with them, began to cry for the first time in a several-year treatment about missing his kids and all the sacrifices he was making. So I think we need to be attentive to not just how they're using screens, but to how we're using screens, and to the kind of the shared overlap in that experience, and how one thing we're not using screens for is actually being together, and that loss is ever present.
Thank you.
Anne?
This does go back actually to the conversation about paleness, but in fact I think it's equally linked with the conversation about slippage, because I found myself thinking about a very recent, very brief exchange with one of my female patients, which I'm now thinking about in the context of our discussion today about frame violations and paleness in a slightly different way. She was talking, as I'm sure many patients are talking now, about the easing of lockdown and how she's been experiencing it. And she was talking about what she felt she was going through, and then seamlessly and in a very seemingly friendly way said, you're going through it too, I know, and you have people you'll be talking about it with. I didn't actually pick it up. I mean, I chose not to. I had some kind of thought process, which was something linked with, she is seeing me as a person now. She didn't used to be able to. There's a therapeutic alliance. She's much more communicative than she was 9 months ago. But thinking about paleness and frame violations, I think if we'd been in the consulting room, I would have picked it up differently. I would have stopped to think about it. I would have had some thoughts about the possibility of denial or creating something too easy. And I think that's why I first thought about this in relation to the discussion about paleness, because if I think about it now, I think there's something a bit pale about my reaction. And in fact, one could see it as a little bit of a frame violation, because I was letting something pass that probably shouldn't be let pass, or that one could certainly be thinking about it in very different kinds of ways.
That's absolutely true. I think it's something that we have, I mean, obviously that sometimes happens in the consulting room, but I think we have to be aware that using devices does tend towards that, to those very sort of, I think, very touching connections. It does loosen that often. You know, I think, you know, obviously things come around again, and they come around again, and to pick it up. But in the research I did, many people said that their countertransference reactions, their ability to have reverie, their ability to stay with, was very much weakened using technology. Some people actually said that was great, that they felt a great relief in using technology because they didn't have such an intense reaction. I mean, and you know, I think that's quite problematic, but that is how it works, and it's something that we look out for.
I think that's why I found the word pale so evocative, because it really brought that particular exchange with my patient right back into the front of my mind, because of the easiness of it.
Yes, easiness is another good description. Yeah.
And there is that tendency to be inclined towards the easy rather than the dark and difficult, because the last thing we want to do is put telepresence at risk.
Yes.
I noticed that Anne had written something about our being focused today on problematic aspects of working with devices, and wondering whether it's a demographic, whether young people have a different relationship with phones and screens. I just want to make a comment on that, because I don't think that's true. You know, as Todd said earlier, the people who are in the most pain about missing the embodied in-person aspect of treatment generally are the people who are digital natives. For a long time, it was assumed that because so many of us, not all of us, but our old fogies who are not, we're digital immigrants, that it's because we feel uncomfortable with using the screen that the problems come up. And I don't think that's true. From the research that I've done, it seems that the digital natives are extremely aware of and very articulate about the differences between being embodied and in person with someone and not. So I think it's too easy to assume that the people who've grown up with technology just can do it and don't have any feelings about it. They can just do it. They are very, you know, adept at using the technology, and sometimes we have to think about it, you know, much more consciously. But they also are really aware of the difference and what they're missing. And I've encountered, even before the pandemic, great grief in young digital natives, and real sort of awareness of what they're missing out on when they're not in an embodied relationship, even though using text and using phones and all of that allows them to slip out of being in an embodied relationship with all of the messiness and risk that implies when you're really there with someone. So just my topic.
Thanks very much, Gillian. We've got 2 more hands raised, and then I think we'll probably, depending on how many people are still wanting to wait to talk, but we'll bring in, so we can bring back Ronan for another question or comment, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Gillian, you sort of half answered my question. I was interested in your research and about what you found out about digital natives versus digital immigrants. What you said that the digital natives are aware and experience a great loss. What I don't understand at the moment, it's my question, is how does that get reconciled with what seems to be an overwhelming preference to conduct themselves, therefore, online, and that their digital identity takes much more space in their overall identity.
I think it's a conflict. I actually think it's a conflict. You know, that many people are choosing to conduct themselves online because it's much more controlled. It's not messy. It's not spontaneous. You can curate your image, and they do that. But at the same time, they feel great pain in doing it. It's really interesting. And when you talk to them about it, they're very critical of it. Sometimes they'll take Facebook sabbaticals or whatever. But if you give digital natives space to think about it, they may opt for it, but they won't say it's better. And actually a lot of it causes them a great deal of pain and conflict and a feeling of being cut off from something very important. Don't know if that answers. Todd might want to add, because he's done a lot of work thinking about this.
Well, just a quick recommendation for the book called The Revenge of Analog by a man named David Sachs. He kind of talks about how digital natives are moving back towards analog experiences like notepads and board games and other ways to kind of actually be physically present. I have one patient who is a woman in her mid-20s who is a big social media influencer with this curated social media presence that is making her a lot of money and funding her treatment, which she now needs because she feels so alienated and disturbed and lonely, and she's completely lost her identity and who she is. So it's a little bit of a paradox, but in my mind, she's the prime example of how the better you are at constructing a digital identity and having a digital life, the more pain you have because of the absence of shared embodiment.
Thank you both. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's a very pertinent points there from both Gillian and Todd. Unless anyone else has a pressing matter, then that will be all from us today. So thank you to everybody that's spoken and asked questions and got involved. Obviously, a special thanks to Gillian and Todd
And
for speaking to us all. Louise, do you want to say something?
yes, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Yes, I just wanted to thank Todd and Gillian so very much. I think I just wanted to say that it feels like we've been given a great deal, actually, and I was aware of really looking forward to today, and like so many social and academic meetings that I've been to, I've looked forward to it, I've enjoyed it, and then I've experienced the loss of it. So I anticipate at the end of this meeting some sort of sense of sadness, because we've been in touch with each other and we've been seeing each other, which is a great source of comfort. And I wanted to say to both you and Todd, and I think others would hopefully agree with me, that what I've particularly enjoyed, as well as the sensitivity and the thoughtfulness, is the humour, and a word that maybe we don't use very much in psychoanalytic work, but the kindness. I feel that you've brought into the work a sense of kindness to colleagues, but also the issues that the patients are facing, to both groups, and we often are both ourselves, therapists and patients. So I've really appreciated the humanity and the kindness that you brought to this both academic and clinical area of work. So thank you. And I'd like to give you a clap or a wave.
Thank you. Thank you so much.